Wow!
Hello, I'm Joe Davidge, Executive Director of the Georgia Center for the Book, an affiliate of the National Center for the Book in the Library of Congress. There are affiliate centers for the book in every state and many U.S. territories. We all help carry out the mission of the National Center for the Book, which is to promote books, reading, libraries, and literacy nationwide. We also promote our state's literary heritage by focusing on books and authors with a connection to our states and territories. Every year, as part of our participation in the Library of Congress National Book Festival, each affiliate chooses books with a local connection to be part of the Roadmap to Reading. These great reads from great places are a collection of books for adult and young readers selected by affiliate centers for the book to celebrate our literary landscape and heritage. Books may be written by authors from the state, take place in the state, or celebrate the state's culture and history. You can learn more about this program and the other centers for the book at read.gov. Today, we are speaking with great read authors from Region 2 East, which includes states and territories from the Allegheny Plateau and the misty Blue Ridge Mountains to the azure blue waters of the Caribbean Sea. Our speakers were invited by affiliate centers for the book from Florida, Georgia, Maryland, North Carolina, Puerto Rico, South Carolina, Virginia, the U.S. Virgin Islands, West Virginia, and the District of Columbia. It is my great pleasure to introduce the authors participating in our discussion today.
So Kings of Beemore is a platonic rom-com, I like to describe it. It's about two best friends who are facing their last day together before one of them moves away. And I'm trying to reckon with this idea of separation and their changing lives as any 16-year-olds are experiencing. And trying to figure out whether their friendship can withstand the distance and the separation. It is a contemporary gloss on the 80s movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off. They go on a Ferris Bueller style day of adventure. And it focuses on two Black queer teenagers in contemporary Baltimore. It is I see it as a romp, but I also see it as a reflection of a Baltimore that I know and I don't usually get to see in books. A Baltimore that is full of art and full of life and full of vibrancy and has a lot of opportunity for two Black teens, two queer teens, which is something that I think if you look at the pop culture about Baltimore, you don't see a lot. But as somebody who is from Baltimore, I know to be true.
Mama's Home is a children's book inspired by my own growing up. I was raised by 8+ mothers. My birth mother died when I was young, and I was raised by great-grandmothers, great aunts, some grandfathers in there, but I was a community baby. And so Mama's Home is about this little girl whose mother has to go away for work, And she, every day of the week, Monday through Saturday, she goes to the home of a different Big Mama. And each time she goes to visit with the Big Mama, all of them have, of course, different points of view and show her different kinds of things, feed her different foods. But she wants to be a different thing, a different, she wants to be a pilot when she was one Big Mama. She wants to be a singer when she's with another Big Mama. And at the end of the week, her birth mother comes home. They have a big feast, and she gets to sleep in her own little bed in her own little house. And it was very much like my own growing up, having different homes that I was welcomed into and had all these different perspectives on what I could be and where I could go into the world.
My book is an adaptation of Beowulf for children. That's how we usually pitch it. It's 600 lines of unrhymed verse epic. And my daughter liked it. My daughter is a very distractible person. She's very smart, but she doesn't usually listen to me, and she doesn't usually listen to me. And I had a lot of trouble getting her to talk to me in the car because, when you're a parent, you imagine your kids will talk to you, and they don't. And I used to take her on a drive to school every morning where she also wouldn't pay attention to me. And one time, as a kind of joke, I started telling her a sort of version of Beowulf minus all the like horrible violence and killing and eating people and stuff. And she was just super engaged. And the really weird part is, so I kept telling her the story day after day because she just kept asking more. I actually had to pull my old copy of Seamus Heaney's Beowulf just to remember what happens. And she kept asking for more. And the really weird part is I started working in elements of the Old English style of verse, meaning, allusions and alliteration in the lines and a certain sort of high tone. And she just got more into it, and she just kept asking for more. There were like scenes I didn't understand until I had to explain them to her. And so this story kind of got away from me, and what I would do is I would rush home and just write down anything that kind of came out nice verbally when I was telling it to her. And over time, it grew into an actual story that was, I thought, completely unpublishable. And then, First Second took a risk on us, I think, and hopefully they feel it worked out. But fundamentally, it's just for my daughter. I thought there weren't many people like her, but it turns out there are at least a few.
My book, Indigo Dreaming, is really special to me. It was inspired years and years ago when a delegation from the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands visited Sierra Leone. And the president of Sierra Leone brought a delegation to the South Carolina and Georgia Sea Islands. So the culture there, the Gullah Geechee culture, has been traced back to West Africa. So that's really, really important. I want young readers to understand the relationship between Africa and the Americas, and many children do not understand that. And I was really thrilled that Ana Cunha agreed to be the illustrator because she's from Brazil, which is such an important place in the African diaspora everywhere in the world where there are people of African descent. So it's a very special book, and it went through lots of iterations and finally found the right editor, Luana Hori, who had the vision to help me make it into what it should be. So I hope it's just a beautiful book that reminds us that we are part of a family that lives all around the globe.
I think that a lot of times we believe that the world that we are being shown through media or the world that is available in a lot of the books that we maybe grew up with is the only world that's out there. And that world maybe is not a world that we totally feel like we exist in. And I think that creates a conflict. It creates a conflict for young people. It created a conflict for me as a young person, not necessarily seeing myself in or my experience reflected in books. And I think one of the beautiful things about story and the beautiful things about art in general is that it can serve as both a mirror and an affirmation. And so with Kings of Be More, I wanted to hold up a mirror to to life as I understood it. And so these boys are surrounded by love and caring, mentors and family members. They have a very diverse group of friends. There isn't a point in the book where they experience homophobia, even though they're both two out queer teens, which to me is not a fantasy of the world. It is a way that the world can exist and perhaps does exist for some people. And again, this takes place over the course of like 3 or 4 days. And so, there will be challenges in their lives, but in this moment, they don't have to encounter that. And so a reader does not have to encounter that. And what happens when you don't have to, when you're not reading a story where the only purpose of the story is to explore trauma. I think it's so important to remind readers of all stripes, all varying identities, that their trauma is not the only important part of their story, that their joy and the things that they love, the people that they love, the places where they find themselves, and the questions that they have about the universe are equally as important. And so I think it is crucial to remind readers, young and old, that we are more than the worst thing that's ever happened to us, and we are more than our quote unquote difference. And that when we see that everybody is actually just their own individual self, and that individuality is what makes us important, then we stop seeing ourselves as stuck in these little boxes, and we get to embrace all kinds of stories, all kinds of experiences, which leads to empathy and which leads to us embracing ourselves and loving ourselves more, which I think is the most important thing for children, young adults to encounter in literature, is a version of themselves that they love and that they can carry into adulthood.
You said it. I just want to co-sign. I want to say, yes, I want your answer to be the answer. Really beautiful. And I will say that when I was growing up, I just wrote a blog post. When I was growing up, my library card was my passport to the world. I lived in a place that was small. There was, I went to the library, the first library for Blacks in my community. And it was a place where I could travel. I could go into that library, pick up a book, and travel 1,000 miles in a few hours. And that was it was important to me to see that the outside world, the experiences and the lives of people in other places around the world, and that there was outer space. There was lots of places to explore. And it was when I began to read books by people that look like me, by African-American authors, especially, Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, that I began to see that my story could be important. I was reading stories that were similar to my, reflecting my story. And I thought, well, if they can tell these stories, I can tell stories too. And so it became a way for me to find out more about myself and about the world. So writing and books and sharing books for me, sharing stories are a way for me to share my own story, but also to encourage people to write their own stories.
I'm kind of wishing I wasn't going third, because those were both really, really good. And I'm just going to whiff on it here. I'm hesitant to sort of claim a mantle of being part of contemporary conversation, because I'm really trying to transliterate a poem that may be as old as the 15th or 5th century. I will say that the theme that for me is engaging, and which I hope a theme way back when, is this idea of the sort of perfection of struggle when things are hopeless in particular. And in addition to that, my hope was to write a contemporary poem that kids could enjoy as a poem, not as a kind of, we often inflict poetry on children and they don't want it and therefore don't appreciate it. I tried to write something that would let them sort of see their struggles as something that could be cast into a high-toned sensibility, if that makes sense. So I'm I don't think I can say it as eloquently as Eric O'Shea, but I did try to, I guess, give kids something they could draw on at some point that made these sort of struggles of early childhood seem real.
Nothing could be more important. We live in turbulent, confusing times, and children need to be part of those conversations. My dissertation is actually on the history of African American children's literature, and one of my favorite publications was a publication that lasted for 2 years, 1920 and 1921, called the Brownies Book. It was published by W.E.B. Du Bois and Jessie Fawcett, and it was a book mainly a magazine mainly for African American children, but for all children. And they confronted all kinds of topics, including how we are part of a world community, anything you can think of. And children are intelligent. Children deserve those answers.
Shay said, my library card was also my passport growing up, it opened up, to echo Shay, it opened up like a world of possibilities and a world of discovery. And I was so compelled by this idea that you can walk into a library and, I was using card catalogs at the time, so flip through a card catalog for a particular subject, and the whole world opened up for you, and that like there was a number that was assigned, to every possible story and experience, question that you had. And so I would spend hours in libraries. I said once at was giving a talk, and I said that, some people talk about their astrological signs, their sun and moon rising. And I'm very curious, like what people's library signs are. Like, I'm from the Enoch Pratt Library in downtown Baltimore, but I'm also from the Park School Library, and I'm also from the Woodlawn Library in Baltimore County. And then as a college student, I was at the Towson Library and the Columbia University. I could go on and on, but I say all that to say that like every one of those libraries was a different kind of a universe, and every librarian in those libraries was both like a sort of oracle and also a fortune teller and also a guide. And so through that discovery, I came across authors like Zora Neale Hurston, who, Their Eyes Were Watching God was like so deeply important to me as a young child. And I think it's because it spoke to an experience of Blackness, and a perspective on Black experience that was so rooted in a love of ourselves and our community. And that's really sort of the journey that Janie goes on in that book. And that was a very early love for me. And then later on, I discovered writers like Colson Whitehead, who continues to be like so deeply important to me as both a writer and as a thinker, and who again is also writing about Blackness in so many different ways and tones and shades, whether it's like speculative sci-fi or sort of alternate history, just sort of straightforward sort of contemporary farce. Just a really invigorating writer, somebody who makes me really proud to be both a reader and excited to be somebody who has a library card and can go find out what else he's up to.
Eric snatched Their Eyes Are Watching God right out of my head, right out of my mouth. I love how you voiced your literary lineage. I love that because I could do that. At one point, I had 5 library cards. I was traveling so much. Everywhere I went, I got a library card, and I felt a little bit guilty. But I am a voracious reader. During COVID, you couldn't go to libraries. It was very difficult to get to libraries, and so that was my window to the world. Being in the library. One of my I have to say that one of my a book that made a very deep impression on me, in addition to Their Eyes Are Watching God, that was a very emotional story for me. I was in it, living it, and I felt like I was swept away in another world. And when I read a good book, the world falls away, and that has become my goal in a way as a writer. I want the world to fall away and for a reader to be kind of in deep into the book. And one of the first books I read that did that for me was The Big Sea by Langston Hughes. And again, I traveled all the miles with him in this story about traveling around the world. And it inspired me as a young person to take off for Paris with $200 and speaking very little French. And eventually it inspired my second novel, Black Girl in Paris. And when that book for me was a way I wanted to empower people who were reading that book to be adventurous, to be bold, and that you don't have to necessarily get on a plane and travel far away to explore the world. You can, be where you are and explore who you are, the world around you, and to just be very curious. I'm a teacher, and so by nature, a creative writing teacher, and by nature, I encourage people to tell their stories. But also, as I move through the world, people tell me, I've got a great story, you should write it for me, or I have a great story to tell. And I was like, have you written in? And they start telling me the story. Have you written any of it yet? And one of the things I love to do, whether it's my Lyft driver or the cashier at the bakery, is I say, okay, get yourself a notebook and I want you to make a list. That's all. Just make a list of some of the most exciting scenes in your story. And when you go to the dentist, I want you to pull out your notebook and I want you to write just a small paragraph, one of those scenes. And it can start anywhere. You can, start where you are, but start to write down your story. Don't keep it in your head. Start to get it outside of your head. Or, young people aren't as, necessarily, everybody's not writing the way we used to. I write everything longhand, but just to encourage people to not only tell their stories, but to begin to write them down. And it's not necessarily about being published, but about sharing their experience with other people, because you never know how that's going to help someone to out of a situation, help them feel empowered, or help them feel hopeful. So as I said, my passion and my purpose is teaching, and that's what I feel like helping people to tell their stories is what I do, whether I'm on the clock or whether I'm in my Lyft.
Kind of like awkward solitary person. And it's the story that popped in mind, one of the fortunately, which is T.H. White's 5-book Candle in the Wind series. People know the first book, which is called The Sword and the Stone, but it's not nearly the best book in the series. And part of why it was motivating for me is because you have a person who's living this kind of quiet life, and who is deeply interested in these old sources of literature that nobody reads anymore, and who writes very strange books. And he ends up writing this series that's deeply drawn on these old French and old English stories, and it becomes weirdly popular. And so, for me as a person doing an adaptation, this is a story I love very deeply, and I love especially the words and the tone that it employs. This Beowulf poem, but we don't know who wrote it or anything other than that it was probably an oral poem. We don't know much beyond that. But I love the sound of it, and I didn't think you could write a book like that anymore. Or I thought if you did trick a publisher into publishing it, that no one would understand it. And the sort of, I would say the delight of my career has been people who send me pictures of them reading it to their children, who seem to enjoy the way they read it to them, the way they're induced to read it by the. So the sort of lesson I've drawn from that, which I hope other people can draw from, is that I think I'd gotten too cynical about what's possible to do in a book. It's very easy if you're someone in the publishing universe. In my other hat, I'm a cartoonist and I write popular science. It's very easy to get very cutthroat and very business oriented. The modern world is very obsessed with influencers and people who can make engaging content every single day. I thought maybe the world didn't have the patience for something like this, and they do. And the lesson to me was I need to be doing even weirder stuff. It turns out there is this well of desire for something that's maybe a little bit deeper and stranger and more ambitious. And so I wish I'd learned that sooner.
every single person has a story, which is why I love visiting schools. I love being a teacher and having discussions with young people. The book that started my whole journey in children's literature is a book called The Times They Used to Be by the poet Lucille Clifton. And it's a beautiful book that is set decades ago, but it deals with all the important things like family, community, history. It even deals with changing technology. It's set at the time when televisions start popping up in neighborhoods. A whole bunch of people in the neighborhood would sit down and watch the television together. Everybody didn't have one in every house and in every room in that house. So, so Lucille Clifton is very, very special to me. And also that book deals with empathy and humanity. So no matter when it was set, it deals with those really important human concerns. And the other thing I want to address is, yes, the whole idea of everyone having a story. I think that is so, so true. And it's really special now that there are just so many platforms, because almost all of human communication is storytelling in a certain way. So I encourage young people to tell their stories however they can. If they write lyrics for rap music, if they're gardeners, if they're photographers, if they like to sew, or if they like telling stories as opposed to writing stories. So I think we all have a story to tell. Each one of us has a story to tell.
My book is Counting on Katherine, How Katherine Johnson Saved Apollo 13. And the reason I wrote this book started when I was 9 years old, because I was a diehard feminist, starting then when people first said, girls aren't as smart as boys to me, and girls can't do math and science. And I said, are you out of your minds? Have you ever met the boys in my school class? They are definitely not as smart as I am. So I became a feminist then, and I was always a fan of justice, because otherwise the world doesn't make any sense. So fast forward, and I was given a job by National Geographic to write a book about space. And it was summer vacation, so my son, I hired him to be my research assistant. There was one section where I needed some space pioneers. And I said to him, Michael, you know your mom, right? You know what you're going to give me? He goes, yeah, no dead white guys. They're not all dead white guys. You know, we have to have all kinds of other things. So he went off, did the research. He said, Mom, I found somebody, you are going to love her. And it was Katherine Johnson. And I was astounded that there was nothing about her. This was before Hidden Figures. So I'm just like, what? How come this person's story has not been told? I am going to tell this story. So the first thing I did was I had to track down Katherine Johnson, right? Not so easy. She was 96 at the time. She didn't really have a web presence. But I did actually do some sleuthing and found her address, and I wrote to her and asked for her permission and blessing to write the book. And what was very amusing was her daughter actually wrote back and said, well, we checked you out, and my grandson has some of your books. So we decided you're okay. You can write the book. So I interviewed her by phone, and I met her family in person. She was not able to take visitors that much at the time, and wrote the book. And For me, it's an extremely important book because it's a true story and it tells about what all people can do. Girls, women, people of color, if we have our brains and we have our opportunity, we can do all things. She was huge. There would have been no successful space program without her. And we need to know her story, not just girls, boys need to know it too. You know, and it's not just for African Americans, it's for everybody, because we all need to know that we're all human beings and we're all capable and we can do great things when given the chance.
Well, I am a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwe, and my tribe is located in North Dakota. So we are water protectors is my book, and it was inspired actually by another tribe they call the Standing Rock Lakota. And they are also in North Dakota, but they are south in what is North Dakota. So I heard about the back in 2016, the camp that was set up and started by, really young people riding on horseback to the Capitol to bring awareness about this situation, about the pipelines and the water, and how the pipeline leaks will affect not just Native peoples but all of us, because of course water is connected, as are we. And so I started to trying to find all the information they could about it back then, which, like I said, was 2016. And there wasn't really anything in the news, like the mainstream media news about it. It was mostly like social media was where I was learning about it through Native friends. And I started reaching out to them and learning about what was going on there at Standing Rock. And I live in the Maryland area right now, so it's really quite far from me, and I had a young son, so I really wanted to be there, and I really wanted to be a part of it, to use my voice, because I felt very strongly about standing up for the water and the land. And then, of course, the camps grew. All 574 federally recognized tribes came, as well as the other, thousands of, there are over 1,000 that are not federally recognized tribes came, people from around the world, indigenous peoples. It grew into just a huge, really a movement of resistance. And so I just felt helpless, and I thought, well, what can I do? And living in DC, I am fortunate because I am able to go to any kind of protest, and I take my son, who he was 8 years old at the time, but now he's 16, and he's actually dragging me, which is great. Anyway, so when I thought, well, I can write a book, maybe if I write a story about it, because maybe someone will read it, just thinking maybe one person would read this and start to understand what's really going on, that it's not just an indigenous issue, it's an all of us issue. So I wrote the story, and it started out as a young adult novel, basically, back when I wrote it, because I felt like there was a lot of information I needed to share, but I thought, well, it's going to take a long time to finish, because and I want people to know about it now. So I sort of changed. Well, I did turn it into a picture book, and I did not expect what has happened with it. So I'm just very honored and grateful at the way the world really has embraced the story, and obviously know and understand that this isn't just an indigenous issue. This is an all of us issue. And since it's been in the world, when it came out in 2020, I've spoken to so many wonderful educators, librarians, teachers, and they use it not just for as a picture book for the 4 to 8 year olds, but it's been used in middle schools, it's been used in high schools, it's used in colleges to build curriculum for teachers. So just the power of a picture book. Books in general, but the power of your voice too for young people is so important. I say to them always, one voice is wrote a book, and this is what happened. So you just never know. So yeah, that's where the inspiration came from. So thank you for that.
I am honored that Dream Builder, the story of architect Philip Freelon, was selected to represent Washington, D.C. I first heard the name Phil Freelon when I moved to North Carolina. So Phil Freelon was an architect here. He lived with his family in Durham. And everywhere I went, I seemed to be something that he had created. So whether it was the Durham Bulls Athletic Park or a terminal and parking garage at RDU Airport, the International Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, the Gantt Center in Charlotte, I kept hearing this name, Phil Freelon. And then, there was all of this celebration around the creation of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And when I read who was creating it, there he was, Phil Freelon. So it was actually a team of three. Sir David Adjaye was the lead designer. Max Bond, a pioneering Black architect, was part of the team. And Mr. Phil Freelon was the lead architect and architect of record. And an editor at Lee and Low reached out to my agent and said, we'd love for Kelly to write about an architect who created the African American Museum in DC. And immediately I knew I wanted to focus on Mr. Freelon. He is someone who has such a rich and powerful story. He was born and raised in Philadelphia in an upper middle class home. He had a teacher mom and a businessman dad and brothers and a sister who were loving and supportive. And in that environment, he really thrived. Early on, he knew he had a gift for art, a gift for math and science. But what I love that I learned through interviewing him and his wife, Nina, who's a Grammy-nominated jazz singer who was so wonderful in helping to make Phil's story come to life, was that he struggled with reading. So he had a reading challenge. I thought it was so important for kids to know that a hero who can seem larger than life has a journey and that they have trials and struggles that they have to overcome. And so this story of this man who created this jewel, this crown of a museum that has realized the dreams of generations, that he had a path to get to that point. And it was because he was poured into by his grandfather, who was part of the Harlem Renaissance, by his parents and his siblings, by believing in himself. And Mr. Freelon really wanted to pass that message on. Sadly, he passed away from ALS before the book was published, but I'm so honored that kids can read about his story and how he used his life to build dreams all over the country, and that they have the power within them to build dreams too.
So my book is called When Sea Becomes Sky, and it is about a girl and her younger brother. They live on an island in North Carolina, and they love to hang out in the salt marsh. So that's the place in between, like where the freshwater and the saltwater meet. And it's kind of a special place because the animals that live there have to deal with a lot of different extremes, because they have to deal with the saltwater when there's more saltwater, they have to deal with freshwater when there's more freshwater. So it kind of becomes this sort of special in-between place. And in the story, the girl's named Bex and her brother Davy, they go every day to their little isolated corner of the salt marsh, and they never see anyone else there. But their island has been having a drought. And so the water in the salt marsh is getting lower every single day. And one day they're out there and they see something sticking up above the water, and they get closer and they find out that it's a statue. So they kind of get set on this adventure as they're kind of figuring out the mystery of where the statue would have come from, and trying to understand that. Meanwhile, they learn that there's a development plan that's going to destroy their whole area. So they decide maybe if they can figure out more about the statue, they can like leverage that and try to protect this place that kind of feels like it just belongs to the two of them. So I'm very much inspired in this story by where I am. So I live in North Carolina and I love it here. And I love going to the beach and I love going to the salt marsh. So definitely inspired by those things. And I'm also inspired by what I came from when I was a kid. So one of the things that I dealt with when I was a young person growing up is that I had a brother who passed away. And so I was really looking to deal with some of the themes of like grief and loss, kind of bringing it into like a different area, looking at the art and kind of the unpredictability of nature and the world around us.
It's crucial. And I can tell you that for me, I'm a very smart lady. And the reason I'm a smart person is because I was a voracious reader as a child. My mother was a teacher, so she taught me how to read before first grade. And I read absolutely everything. Absolutely everything. You know, the back of the cereal boxes, but every single book, for whether it was aimed at me or not, adults, children, whatever. And that's how I learned about the world. I also learned about myself from meeting characters in books that were maybe not like me on the outside, but like me on the inside. And that formed who I became as an adult. Now, I would not be as broad-minded. I would not know as much, just general facts. I wouldn't be as empathetic if I hadn't been a reader. So for us as adults to create books of every kind of stripe that you can imagine, from every kind of point of view, is essential for every kind of reader. You don't know what's going to appeal to any particular person, but I always tell kids when I go to schools, there is a book that's just for you. And if you say you don't like reading, it's because you haven't found it yet, but you will. And it is part of how, as a country, for example, how we are going to come together if we're sharing stories, common stories that are inspirational stories that also rely on fact. You know, you can't just make it all up. Like, that's great if it's a fantasy, but we have to tell the real stories as well about real people who did things despite odds. Like Jillian was saying, you know, that it's people don't have a silver spoon necessarily over their heads. The people who have succeeded have done so by overcoming all kinds of challenges. And kids are going to have those same challenges. You know, that's the way life is. By having all the different stories, you're also preparing kids for dealing with trouble in real life. You know, if you're dealing with grief in a book, then when grief comes into your life, as it inevitably will, you're more prepared than if it hits you just out of the blue and nobody has even mentioned any of this to you. So if you want to prepare children to become full human beings and competent adults, they need books, stories of all kinds.
Thinking about the question, I think about me because I was born a long time ago in the 60s. When I grew up, I never saw myself in books. I never saw myself in a positive way. If Native people were portrayed in books, it was always in a negative way, stereotypical, or, you know, the savage Indian and that sort of thing. Especially for me, as I said, I loved reading. Obviously, we all do. Yeah, otherwise, we wouldn't be authors, creatives. But I just remember loving, in my home life, sometimes was not so great. So for me, books were a great escape and a wonderful place to go when I needed to get away. And when Little House on the Prairie series was like the main sort of series available to me when I was young, and as a young person, I loved the family unit and the closeness and the way the father and the mother and the children, you know, related to each other, and I wanted that in my family life. But yet, when I saw how I was portrayed to my people, I knew that they would not welcome me in that family ever at that door. They would probably, you know, it would not be good. So I was very torn as a child and very ashamed of who I was. Just of all books had an effect on me in that regard. And so as I now have a, you know, voice in writing books and the world of publishing, and I will not, you know, all stories must portray Native, especially, and I can just speak as a Native author, Native children as a positive way. We must be shown contemporary in the world as we are, not as people from the past. You know, those things get said to me. I thought you were gone. I thought we got rid of you all. You know, things that are very hurtful, and children should never have to deal with those type of things. They should be a part. They should see themselves in books, and they they should and other children who are not BIPOC, LGBTQ+, should see those children in books, so that that's what community, that's how we build community, is by having all of these books available, especially to communities where there is not a large diverse population or a large LGBTQ+ population, because that stuff is key to creating the empathy and the need, that we need in this world. I mean, because kids get it. When I talk about we are water protectors, it isn't hard to tell them about the importance of water. They get it. They know. It's not like trying to go all through mud and all this other red tape we have to get through to speak to adults. So my hope is, I have so much hope for the future, because I know young people know what's important. So yeah, I love writing for kids, and it's just a gift, and I love it, and I'm grateful for it every day. So
so Dream Builder, it was a chance to help kids realize that they matter, that they are here for a reason, and that they have gifts. And just like Phil Freelon, who, had this journey where he doubted himself and he felt bad because he couldn't read at first, and then he grew and he, found what he was meant to do. That's the same thing that we want our kids to know. So that's why it was really important for me to share Phil's, Mr. Freelon's story from when he was young all the way until he became this, brilliant architect. One of the other aspects of his story is that when he went to architecture school, which he loved and he really excelled, he didn't see himself in the architects that were being shared. And so one of the things that's really cool about him, I live in the Triangle where he built his practice and raised his family. And he's a founding member of the 100 Black Men chapter here. And their motto is, what they see is what they'll be. And so what happens when you go into a space and you don't see people who look like you, that are realizing these different dreams? Do you wonder if that is something that you can aspire to? Mr. Freelon found those architects on his own. He dug in the library, and there they were waiting for him. So he found, Julian Abel, who actually designed part of Duke University right here in the Triangle. And he also found Paul Revere Williams, who was an architect to the stars in Hollywood. And those were people, along with his grandfather, was part of the Harlem Renaissance, who he drew from, and he knew because they did it, that he could do it too. What I also love, and I think is also a lesson to pass on to kids about what they can do, is that he became an architect with a purpose. He made a pledge that he would never design prisons, and he would never design casinos, and he would only design things that lifted people up and brought joy and brought light. And so I think it's so important for kids to know that they have the power to make a difference, to change lives in big ways and in small ways. When I go into schools and talk about Mr. Freelon, I often say to the kids, who likes to draw? And they raised a bunch of kids raise their hand, who likes to build? And that's my opening, because we have more in common than we have differences. But when it comes to books by Black authors, when it comes to books with Black figures that are on the cover, sometimes what I call it is the fear of a brown face. And there are usually adults that are the gatekeepers that are keeping kids from our books. But kids always find a way in. They always connect. So I would urge adults to please get out of the way and let the kids, dream and grow and connect and love and be with each other through books. Books are safe spaces where we can talk about hard topics, where we can see ourselves, where we can find commonality. And so that's what I think is the power of books and what all of our books do. I'm really honored to be on this panel today. I'm a fan of everybody's work. And so please, just remember that kids know what they need. And if we get out of the way, they will often find it.
Yes. So, sorry, that was just really lovely. I'm just trying to soak it in for a minute. So I would say that writing for children is a great joy. It is the best audience you could ever have. And I know that because kids will carry around a book with them, whatever they do. I see that with my kids, and they're brushing their teeth and they're walking up and down the stairs, and you're like, look where you're going. And they're just so willing to enter into those stories and willing to make those stories a part of who they are too. So it is a joy to write for children, and it is also a great privilege. One thing I talk about when I see kids and we do school visits is that reading creates empathy, and empathy is a superpower. So the more stories that you get to read by different people, by people who are like you, by people who are not like you, all different stories being represented, you are becoming stronger. Your heart and your mind is being engaged, and you have that opportunity to make connection with others, which is really what I think we're all here on the planet to do. So reading is a really important conduit to that.
Huge question. And I've been wrestling as I'm sitting here thinking, how am I going to approach this? Which story do I want to tell? What's going to make the difference? So I decided I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own story. I wanted to be a writer since I was, 5 years old. I started reading and I immediately started writing. I knew right away that the two things were connected, that real people wrote books and I was a real people, so I could write a book. By the time I got to 5th or 6th grade, everyone knew, right? Helene's going to be a writer. She's going to write. This one's going to be an accountant. This one's going to be the writer. He's going to be the scientist. And so I'm 11. And then what happened, I got into junior high school and I lost confidence, because that's what happens often when you become a teenager. People often know that your body changes when you're going through puberty, but people don't know that your brain always changes. Like when you're a kid, your brain is organized like this to absorb information. It's like a sponge. As adults, our brains are like this. They're designed to see patterns and make patterns and see connections between things. So when you're a teenager, your brain goes from this to this. And your teenage years, a lot of the time it's spent like this, right? The connections are not there. So what happens is people lose confidence because your brain's not working the way you always did. Things are just not right and you're doubting yourself. So this happened to me. And I said, why should I get to be a writer? I'm not lucky enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't know the right people. There's no fairy dust on me. I'm just an ordinary person. So I stopped writing. I gave up because I thought there's no point. And everything was okay. I went on with my life and things were good. And it wasn't until, I was 125 years old that I realized I had made this huge mistake, because I still wanted to be a writer. I still wanted to be a writer. And the mistake that I had made was that I stopped writing, because the moment you stop, that's the moment when your dream dies. Okay? Yeah, it was true. It's the moment I stopped, I was never going to be a writer. But if I had kept writing, I could have eventually become a writer. And even if I didn't, I still had a dream. And the dream keeps you going, right? The dream makes you get up in the morning and say, I have a purpose, I have a goal, I have something that I want to achieve. So I started writing again. And it took 5 years before my first book was published, and another 5 years before the second was published. And after that, it's not been a straight line, I can tell you. I've written a lot of books, but every single one of them was a challenge, and it's still a challenge. But it's exciting to me because often, too, people now say to me, oh, you write for children, isn't that cute? When are you going to write a real book, right? Have you all heard that? When are you going to write a real book? And I'm like, oh, because to me, writing for children is the most important kind of writing, because, I remember all the books that I read when I was a kid that really influenced me. You asked me what I read last week, I won't be able to tell you. I still read all the time. I don't know what I read. But the books that changed my life were children's books. And what gives me the gratification now, what makes me happy that I did return to the dream, is when a child comes up to me and said, did you write that book? Yeah. And he said, my little sister learned how to read using that book. Or, did you write that book? Yeah. It really helped me when I was going through a bad time. And, there's nothing else in the world that to me is more valuable than knowing that you are affecting somebody's entire life. in that positive way. So that's my story.
Yes, for this one, I also had a tough time trying to think about what to say, what to talk about, but I think I want to talk about librarian. That meant something special to me as a young person. Again, as I said prior, that books were a real big saved me a lot, as I know what they do for a lot of people, especially young people. They're escape. And so the library moved down the street from my house when I was, I don't even know, maybe 8 or 9. Oh my gosh, it was like the happiest day of my life. So then I could walk down there or ride my bike. And so that's where I was every Saturday and Sunday. First thing in the morning, as soon as the library opened, I was there. And I stayed all day long, pretty much just anywhere I would be in the stacks. And back in my day, we didn't have the different picture books and middle grade and YA. It was like juvenile fiction adults, so I was just always wanting to know why were things the way they were. So I just spent most of the day in the stacks in the nonfiction area, just pulling books off the shelf and sitting on the floor and looking through them and just trying to make sense of the world. And there was a librarian there. She was older, she had white hair, and I don't know her name. And I know she didn't know mine, because I would never have told her. I would never have spoke to anybody. I was way too shy. But when I went to the library and walked through those doors, I always looked for her. I was just so happy to see her. And when she would ask me if I ever needed help, she was always pointing me in the right place. And I just think a lot of librarians and educators and teachers don't realize how important they are, and the impacts they have on children's lives every single day. And that some days they have a really tough times, and the world is really hard right now, of course, and especially with books and banning and whatnot. But I just I want all educated librarians and people just with books to just know that there's a child somewhere that really is so grateful for you and loves you so much, and will never tell you because they're way too shy. But you are really making a big difference in their lives. And just thank you. And I know that child feels the same way. So that's all I have to say about it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I love the theme of everyone has a story. Early in my children's book journey, I went to the writer's workshop at Chautauqua, which is created by the Highlights Foundation. And one of the speakers was editor and author Patty Gouch. And her message, one of the many powerful messages that she gave, was write the story only you can tell. And that is a message I've carried with me through my entire children's book career. And to me, what it means is that who you are is not just enough, it's everything. So it comes from, your passions, things that you love. It comes from trials, things you've had to work through and figure out, that you've triumphed over, or you're still in the midst of navigating. It comes from whose you are. So your family and your community and your faith home and your culture. And it comes from where you're from. And I think all of those things are where we find the best stories, that treasure that is already inside of you. So I would say to kids, when you're thinking about stories and thinking that authors, that's something that's way out of your reach, just dig into your heart and put who you are on the page. And that's magical and that's powerful. And we need your voice. I also think about kids that may be a bit intimidated at first by the written word. And I think it's really important as a picture book author to celebrate and shout out our illustrators who do such a masterful work of visual storytelling. So Laura Freeman, award-winning author, did the art for Dream Builder, and she really just brought, so many things to life. I always tell kids, read a picture book, read it for the meaning, read the words, but you really miss something if you don't go back and read the art. So please, with, when you look at picture books, take your time and look at all the messages and all of the meaning that they've put into those illustrations. So when everyone has a story, it could be that your story comes out in writing. It could be that your story comes out in art, and that is perfect and wonderful. It could be that you want to tell your story with the voice function of your cell phone. You want to do it orally. That's also wonderful. There's no one right way to tell a story. And I just feel really blessed that I get to do what I love every day. I think that, I'm very grateful to the National Book Festival for celebrating our work. So I just wanted to share a few resources that might be helpful for parents, librarians, and teachers. I'm a founding member of a blog called The Brown Bookshelf, and we've been around for more than a decade, and we have a vast archive of profiles and spotlights on Black children's book creators. So I also wanted to share a few other resources for you that include the African American Children's Book Project, We Need Diverse Books, American Indians in Children's Literature, Cynsations, that's CYNSATIONS. And I also wanted to shout out the Authors Guild and PEN America, who have been working so hard to educate and to mobilize against book banning. Books are being reviewed, they're being challenged, they're being banned, and we can come together and stop that from happening by celebrating and supporting those books.
So When Sea Becomes Sky is definitely the most personal book that I've written. And the reason for that is it's the book that I really wanted when I was a kid, and I couldn't find it. So I mentioned my brother passed away when he was 9 and I was 11. We were really close. And whenever I have, even now with the problem, I often look to books for answers, especially as a kid. I often look to fiction for answers to kind of see what other people did in similar situations. And so my favorite book during that time for me was Charlotte's Web, because I think it is just such a beautiful story that is, it's such a short number of pages and there's so many feelings in there. And it really gave me permission to have all of the emotions that I had when Andy died. But there was one thing that it didn't explain to me in that story. I guess spoiler alert, but Charlotte dies, and then we kind of fast forward a little bit and the baby spiders are born and everybody is kind of like, clearly Wilbur is feeling better. And as a little girl, I was like, how did that part happen? I want to know the part where you start to feel better, because that's the part that I'm having a hard time with. And I do want to feel better. I still want to know how to do that. So that was something that has been with me since I was 11, that I wanted to write a book that shows that part where things start to get better. And so that was definitely, what I tried to do with When Sea Becomes Sky. And hopefully kids out there who have experienced grief will kind of feel seen with that, and possibly for kids who haven't experienced it will have some of those thoughts and can make some of those connections, before they unfortunately have to deal with it in their own lives.